What's up, readers? Miggy here, and welcome to a new episode of Miggy Reads. And for today, we have read a new book. It's called Find Me by Andre Aciman. This is actually the sequel to the famous Call Me by Your Name, which was a movie in 2017 and the novel in 2007. This is the sequel released in 2019 last year. I actually bought it on first day for how much is this? 895 pesos, but I haven't had the time to actually read it before. I have only read two of his novels, one being Call Me By Your Name, and two is a collection of essays. It's called False Papers. So this novel is split into four parts, namely Tempo, Cadenza, Capriccio, and De Capo. The first one, Tempo, is set 10 years after the events when Call Me By Your Name started. It follows the narrative of the father, Sammy, or Samuel. By the start of this novel, Sammy has already divorced his wife after Elio finished his college and became this gifted pianist. Actually, this part reminds me so much of Before Sunrise, the movie, where two strangers meet on a train. By this time, I think Sammy is around 50 to 60 years old, and he meets this young girl named Miranda, who was a photographer, but she doesn't seem to make a connection with someone or last that long because she finds people disinteresting after a while. They're both on their way to visit Rome. Sammy is going to visit Elio, and they do these traditions they call vigils, in which they visit places they had memories of and go to them. For Miranda, she visits her father, who was sick and dying at almost the same age as Sammy, but who the two are very similar in ways because they are both university professors. He realized that his life he was not really that happy after all. So that now that he meets Miranda, they do this thing, they explore the world together. So in page 11, Sammy gives this line that I really love. It says, "To walk back the compliment I added, it's just that the magic of someone new never lasts long enough. We only want those we can't have. It's those we lost or who never knew we existed who leave their mark. The others barely echo." This is a part where Sammy says that it's easier opening up to strangers. That is why Miranda and he are having that conversation and opening up and eventually starting this non-conventional relationship that they weren't sure of. This first part is more of like a really long short story that takes up almost half of the book. So the second part, called Tempo, follows Elio. So this was set 15 years after the events of the first book. Elio is already teaching pianist. He's already this gifted pianist who is very talented in playing the classics. This part is Elio meeting with Michel, who is an old man who was as old as his father. So the first two parts, Tempo and Cadenza, were about two unconventional couples, one really young and the other really old. Elio finally opening up to someone and seeing, and Michel, this old guy, reminded him so much of Oliver, who he tried to forget, and he actually never really moved on from the events 15 years prior to this meeting. They eventually started this really passionate relationship. In the second part of the novel, it actually turns into this mystery novel type of genre that I think was unnecessary, or I think it could have worked if it was the whole part of the novel, because it was really compressed into those few around 80 pages of the second part. So they were like discovering this secret letter from Michel's father, who ages ago left him this cryptic message, tried to decipher what Michel's father wanted to tell his son. It's really arbitrary. Like, it was confusing, but plot-wise, there was no conflict that you are going to follow through the novel. It's more like a very extended epilogue of the first book. So it is actually really essential to have read the first book before coming into the sequel, because then you will never get anything, but you may come to appreciate Aciman's writing. I really like his writing style. It's very flowy, it's very literary in a sense. you're not gonna stop when you start to read the way he writes, and I just want to compliment that. I think me continuing to read this novel was more of I really adore Andre Aciman's writing rather than what story he tried to make with this novel. I think that the first book as a standalone was really enough. So the third and fourth parts were really short. They're called Capriccio, and this follows the perspective of Oliver, who by this time already had a wife and sons, I think, and they are living in New York, and he is a professor. The story for Capriccio happens in is like the Spedida party, or this farewell party before they move to New Hampshire, I think. So basically this is more of how Oliver was reminded so much of Elio in these two people who he was really tempted to cheat with throughout the few pages of that chapter. It concluded with Oliver realizing that he was living a life full of regret. He was unhappy, although he had a family, and he was a really good professor. He was doing really well career-wise. He had missed so much part of his life, and that was when he visited Elio. This third part and fourth part was 20 years after the first book. So there was like 10, 15, 20 time skip, which was after the first book. And then the first part of the Capo was more of an epilogue of this really long epilogue. So Elio's dad, Sammy, and Miranda, who we met from the first part, had a child, and they named him Oliver, named after Oliver. And Oliver left his family to go to Italy to be finally with Elio. Oh, I forgot to tell you that in the end of the second part, on Elio's perspective, it was more like a fling, but it was a passionate fling. Michelle said that he knew, even despite all of that, that he was really going to come back to this first love. Ending was they still ended up together. They are back to the house, back to their home from the first novel. So they were raising little Ollie, practically Elio's half-brother. And then in this part, Sammy's already dead, because that is the ending of Call Me By Your Name. You have read that, or this wasn't shown in the movie, but in the novel, it's more of a happy ending, but a little bit sad because of the choices they made. So basically, Oliver leaving his wife and children for Elio to finally have this real great love that they once had. It was really sentimental, but I think the plot points were really all over the place. Still, when I read it, it was very sentimental to me. There were a lot of good values that I had come to respect while reading this novel. I liked how in this novel slash really long epilogue, how Oliver described people coming into his life as screens. These two people who he was really tempted to cheat with, he considered them screens because they aren't really what he wanted, but these were merely a distraction to what he really wanted. So it's more of how do you live a life with regret when from two people, like how do you live 20 years full of regret and eventually not realizing you were repressed all along. You see these screens, which are people, and these people remind you of a past that you really were passionate about. It was immature, yet it was good love. It's literally love you see in the books and in the movies. I didn't read any reviews before reading this novel, but after I read it, I saw many negative reviews from the New York Times and everywhere else in Goodreads that they didn't like this book, that this book was actually unnecessary. But I think it was really unnecessary, but it was, I think, a good epilogue of an epilogue. Despite that, I still give it a passing score of 3 out of 5 on Goodreads because it was interesting to see how their life turned out, and it didn't give us a full-on fan service of both Elio and Oliver meeting up, but instead they gave us, it was literally this part of the novel. This part was where the two meet again, and the rest were just extra. Andre Aciman gave you blue balls all throughout these pages, giving you different stories, different narratives of the people involved in the first novel, and then actually giving you an ending where the two of them meet again. And to make an effort like that, I think was a really good attempt, but it was not polished. It was really reckless. I think that the hype of the first movie really made people read and buy this sequel, but the expensive price tag on this thing, which is 900 pesos basically, and it's a paperback and not a hardbound. Was not worth it. I wished I could have downloaded an ebook of it or borrowed it from somebody else. I'm willing to lend this to anyone so that my money doesn't go to waste. But anyway, if you really are a fan of the first book/movie, I really suggest you still read this. It still has a good retelling of their lives and how they grew up to be, if you're interested in that. It's okay if you just read the first book, because that first book was really a masterpiece. I don't even want to call it the first book because it was the book, and this was just like fan fiction or an OVA episode/movie of this anime you really love. And I give it a 3 out of 5 for beautiful language, as always, by Sir Andre Aciman. And all in all, this is the worst book of him that I've read, and I've read a few of his essays or excerpts from the other books. I read this in like 2 sittings. First sitting on the first 2 parts, on the first part, and then the second sitting on the last 3 parts. It's a really short novel. It's 270 pages, and you can do this in 1 sitting. Never go do this without reading the first story. If you liked this video, you can watch my first book review I posted a week ago, and thank you for watching.